Chapter 1. Jack. Of all the animals, snowshoe bunnies are the luckiest. And of all the snowshoe bunnies, the luckiest by far was Jack Robberts. He wasn't lucky in the sense that he had a good family, or a shiny new bicycle, or a great-uncle's inheritance locked away in a bank somewhere. The fact was, Jack had no family, no bicycle, and certainly no inheritance locked away in so much as a buried coffee can. Jack was lucky in the most basic sense of the word. Things happened to Jack. Sometimes they were good things. Sometimes they were bad things. Luck didn't seem to favor positives or negatives, it just happened. Luck was the reason for most everything that happened to Jack. Why he had no family, why he lived here in this grimy old house on the far end of a grimy old alley. And it was because of luck that he was confined to his bed in the narrow, tent-shaped attic, while the 12 other beds sat unmade and unoccupied. Jack was small, even for a 6-year-old, a fact that was exaggerated by his overlong ears and big feet. He had butterscotch fur, big, curious eyes that made him look as though he was afraid of just about everything, which he constantly reminded himself he most certainly was not, and wore clothing that looked as though it had been handed down 5 times, which, of course, it had. Currently, Jack sat at the side of his bed facing the window, his V-shaped nose pressed against the glass as he peered down upon the alley 3 stories below. The other kids had disappeared, off on some adventure while he sat imprisoned for a crime he hadn't committed. As he stewed over the injustice of it all, he spotted a newspaper tumbling down the alley. It was only 1 page, the front by the look of it, and it was crumpled and oil-stained, but that didn't bother Jack. 6-year-old bunnies don't usually care about things like newspapers, but Jack lived in a city protected by heroes, and the punts rarely let him watch television. He'd taught himself to read, and was getting quite good at it, just so he could follow their adventures. "It's too far down," he told himself. "It's too far down, and you won't reach it in time." Then something happened. A wonderful something. The newspaper became caught on a milk crate. He didn't need to think twice. He flung his legs over the other side of the bed, practically flew out the door, and began giddily down the carpeted stairs. It wasn't until he reached the 2nd floor that the punts entered his mind. She was still somewhere inside. Mrs. Eloise Punts, the heavy-set old owl who never insisted on being called Mom, had always scared Jack. From her wide, circular eyes to her cigarette-scented apron, there was little to find redeeming about the Punts. Catching Jack out of his room when he was supposed to be grounded would probably delight her, as it would give her a reason to swat him with her wooden spoon and deny him dinner yet again. But none of this was what glued him to the stair. He was thinking instead about her zombie head. Or at least that's what the other boys had called it when he told them what he had seen. It had been about 8 weeks ago, on Freedom Day. The Punts had made a casserole to celebrate the occasion, and since dinner here usually consisted of feed and wilted salad, Jack couldn't resist the temptation to sneak downstairs for some midnight seconds. Miraculously, or perhaps luckily, this was also the first night in living memory that the Punts had neglected to lock the attic door. He had just made it past her bedroom at the foot of the stairs when he froze. She was facing away from him in the kitchen doorway, silhouetted against a dim nightlight. He stood unmoving for a moment, his eyes wide and watching. Then he heard a snore. She was sleepwalking. His hungry belly growled, insisting that there was enough room between her and the door jamb, but it hadn't mattered anyway. In his excitement, Jack forgot to skip the squeaky panel in the floorboard. The old owl's head had swiveled around until it sat cleanly backward between her shoulders, 2 glowing yellow eyes glaring widely down at him. He had screamed himself hoarse by the time he'd reached the attic. Jack shuddered at the memory. He peered between the beams of the railing, trying to catch a glimpse of the front room, ears perked and breath held. The television crackled, melodramatic voices muffled by white noise. Braving 3 more steps, he peeked around the wall. There she sat in her favorite smoke-scented armchair, her head resting limply on her shoulder. His heart rose at the sight, but he proceeded cautiously all the same, slowed by visions of the Punce chasing him up the stairs, her head spinning around and around like a police siren. When he cleared the front room, remembering that creaky board, of course, he closed a padded paw around the door lever, his wide eyes never leaving the Punce as he turned it. After a tense moment in which the old owl dropped the remote control and gave a snort and a lurch, she fell back asleep, and Jack slid through the widest gap he dared make in the oil-wanting door. Gently, he pulled the door until it clicked shut. He had done it. He was outside. His heart pounding heavily, he leapt down the staircase and landed clumsily on the pebble-strewn pavement, spotting the newspaper instantly. It had escaped the milk crate and was sliding toward the main city street. By the time Jack reached the crowded sidewalk, the newspaper had taken a left and was picking up speed. "Wait!" he yelled after it, and started pushing his way through a forest of trousered and skirted legs of all colors and sizes. When he spotted the newspaper again, it was being drawn open by a pair of spindly pink fingers seated at a coffee shop table. "Oh dear," an aged voice said from behind the newspaper as the same fingers flicked open a pair of reading glasses. "Well, this changes things, doesn't it?" The voice fell silent as the figure behind the paper put one leg over the other, tossing a long pink tail over his lap as he did so. Alongside him sat a young fox, a few years older than Jack, and far better cared for by the look of him. He caught Jack's eye, unabashed, and took a sip from his soft drink. Jack wasn't going to lose his paper so easily. He'd risked another hungry night for that scrap. "Excuse me," he said as forcefully as a young bunny can. No response. The fox watched him unhelpfully. "Excuse me," he said a little louder. "That's mine." This time the page lowered, and an elderly and slender-nosed rat peered over it, found Jack's ears, and followed them down. "Oh, hello there," he said in a friendly tone. "What did you say, my boy?" Jack shifted uncomfortably. "The newspaper," he said sheepishly, trying his best to ignore the impolite stare of the fox. "It's mine." The rat looked questioningly toward his companion. "Don't know what he's talking about," the fox boy said. "I bought it the same place I always buy it." "No, he didn't," Jack interrupted. "It's just blown over here on the But he fell short. This newspaper wasn't oil-stained or torn. More than that, it wasn't only the front page, but a thick stack of pages. He felt his cheeks grow hot. The rat folded the paper and laid it on the table before him. "What's your name, son?" "Jack." "My name is Dr. Einar Walraven," he continued. "This young fellow," he indicated the fox, who had become interested in a scuff mark on the table, "is Alan Cale, my assistant. Every morning I send him to purchase a newspaper for me. He's just returned with this one. That said, I can always buy another." He paused thoughtfully. "Why don't you have a seat, Jack?" he said. When he had flagged down the poodle waitress and ordered Jack a cherry cola, he continued. "You read the news?" Jack shrugged. "Let me guess," Dr. Walraven said with a knowing wink. "King of Hearts fan?" Jack met his eyes for a brief moment. The rat smiled. "Who isn't, right?" The corners of Jack's mouth twitched. "I'm guessing you've got a whole collection of these." But before Dr. Walraven could finish his statement, Jack's eyes wandered to the newspaper on the table, and he gave a surprised yell. Realizing that he had interrupted, he apologized and sank back into his chair. "That's quite all right," the rat said, rotating the paper so that Jack could read it properly. "No more sidekicks," the headline declared in bold black letters. He read it again, disbelieving. It was Jack's fondest ambition, the thought that allowed him to sleep in that hot, overcrowded attic every night. Becoming a sidekick, tagging along as a hero's apprentice, was every kid's dream. No more sidekicks? The headline might as well have read, "No more birthdays" or "No more ice cream." "They can't do this," he said. Dr. Walraven looked gravely at the paper. "I'm afraid there really isn't much of a choice," "But why?" Jack asked. In answer, Dr. Walraven sipped his tea and nodded toward the paper as if to say, "Read on." Jack looked back down and continued reading. Beneath the headline, a subheading read, "Controversial Apprentice Program Ends Following Child's Death." The article featured a black and white photo of an otter in a sports cap. Forests of whiskers framed a comically broad nose and a confident, almost cocky smile. He didn't look older than 12 or 13, around the same age as the fox boy. The article continued. In a move deemed by some to be long overdue, Animal Control, the famed hero league founded and helmed by the great King of Hearts, has announced the closure of its apprenticeship program following the death of teenage hero hopeful Avok Terrell. Started more than 30 years ago, the program matched aspiring young hopefuls with AC heroes that could teach and train them to pick up the hero mantle in years to come. The Future Generations Act made it possible for heroes to take these up-and-comers, children, mind you, on serious, often dangerous missions. "It's heartbreaking what has happened," says one expert, "but a surprise? These children are dragged along on capers that frequently endanger their lives. Perhaps the only surprise is that it's taken this long for such a so-called adventure to end in tragedy." While authorities continue to search for Terrell's body, a few factors must be considered. As we reported weeks ago, the body of Sander Redding, better known as White Stripe, was discovered at the location where Terrell is last known to have been. It must be noted that Terrell wasn't White Stripe's sidekick, but that of the one and only King of Hearts, which begs the question, what was Avok Terrell doing in the most dangerous part of the city with a hero who wasn't even his own mentor? The article continued, but something didn't make sense to Jack. "Hang on," he said, looking up. "It says he disappeared and that he hasn't been found, but the headline says that he's dead. How do they know?" Dr. Walraven gave an impressed nod. "Very good," he said. "Whenever someone joins Animal Control, they are given a tracker. It's a sort of tag that's implanted under the skin, typically right here," he said, tapping the back of his own left shoulder. "It makes them easier to find, should they ever need backup or disappear mysteriously." "So can't they find him with that?" "They certainly should be able to do so, but Avok's tracker has vanished. That in itself isn't too strange. Avok's Hytena, that is, his superpower, allowed him to transform into pure water, and whenever he did, his clothes, his hat," he touched the photograph, "anything he was holding would transform with him. This included his tracker, so he couldn't be traced in that form. His Hytena had one tremendous weakness. If he stayed in his water form for too long, or was exposed to the wrong elements, such as an overheated sidewalk, he could evaporate." He nodded at the shocked look on Jack's face. "Avok hasn't been traceable for nearly 3 weeks now. That's far too long for him to stay in that form." Jack looked back at the picture of the otter boy and felt a great rush of pity. This was just a kid, one with the same dreams Jack himself cherished. Dreams that came true. Dreams that ended in his death. Jack shuddered. Dr. Walraven gestured toward the poodle, who strode over and set a small tray with a piece of paper in front of him. "Well, Jack," he said in a formal tone as he extracted paper money from his wallet and placed it on the tray. "Please feel free to keep the paper. We have a few things to take care of before catching our S-train this evening, so I'm afraid we must—" "You're going to ride an S-train?" Jack interrupted. The idea of traveling across the sea in a submersible train was nearly as impressive to Jack as the rat's knowledge of Animal Control. The fox's face drew into a smug grin, as though being impressed by such things was childish, but Dr. Walraven's smile was genuine as he rose from his seat. "I have to get to Sapley for a very important meeting. An S-train is the fastest way to get there." Setting a briefcase on the table, he popped it open, tucked away the lunch receipt in one of the interior pockets, replaced a spiral-bound notepad, and snapped the briefcase shut again. Jack noticed the gold engraving just beneath the handle, E.W. The doctor placed a chalk-white Homburg hat atop his head, his ears flattening beneath it. "I suppose we have everything," he said to the fox, who gave an affirming nod, a supercilious frown on his face as he looked about them. "Well then, Jack," the rat continued, "can we walk you back to your home?" Jack slid from his chair. Then, as if unable to stop himself, he blurted, "One day I'm going to be a hero." Alan scoffed, earning a reproving glance from Dr. Walraven. The old rat met Jack's eyes with a genuine smile. "I believe you will, Jack." The three of them began down the sidewalk, never seeing the many eyes that followed them from a nearby alley.